Okay, in keeping with the same theme, I want to talk about the metabolism of early life. So, when we think of metabolism, we might think about glycolysis, gluconeogenesis, citric acid cycle, Cori cycle, any of these kind of things come to mind. But it's quite possible that, and is pretty much true, that these were not available, obviously. The early Earth did not have a great deal of oxygen. It wasn't until this cyanobacteria really took over and sort of created the oxygen-rich atmosphere we have today. So oxygen wasn't available. So what did they do? They had to do some kind of metabolism. So what they ended up doing was just anaerobic oxidation and reduction, okay? Anaerobic oxidation and reduction. So they oxidized molecules and they were generated by and driven by UV light. So essentially what I'm saying here is that light energy provided the energy to in most cases probably reduce some sulfur or iron or some other mineral, some other element, okay? And that was a useful way of going about things, because remember I said before that there's a lot of these things were on the early Earth, so it was quite possible that this was one of the ways in which the early metabolism got along. Now the other thing is light-driven ion pumps. And you might say, well, light-driven ion pumps, that's still around today, and you'd be correct, because there are bacteria, particularly archaea, that still use a light-driven ion pump. And the one I can think of off the top of my head, I think, is bacteria rhodopsin. Okay, and what that does actually is it's actually quite similar in a lot of ways to some of the pumps that we have in our body. But anyway, what happens is some light, strikes a protein. The protein changes conformation, pumps protons to create a concentration gradient. So it's extremely useful, very similar, I suppose, to the concentration gradient in the inner mitochondrial membrane that is used for ATP production in our bodies. Another thing could be methagenesis or methanogenesis. That's just the idea of using water and H2 and H2 and carbon dioxide rather to produce methane gas and H2O. Now this was an important process on the early Earth, because what methane gas actually does is, and if you think about it, it's a greenhouse gas, right? So it actually heats the early Earth. So it's really important that this went on early in Earth's life, or whatever you wish to call it, existence. This was important. It helped heat the Earth early on. Now, today, it's terrible because it causes, climate change. But still, it was an important process. And there's still, again, archaea, mostly archaea, I believe, are the only ones I can think of that still use this same type of metabolism. So the same type of metabolism is still going on. Another interesting one, of course, is oxygenic photoautotrophs. So that's what I talked about. This came much later, and that's that cyanobacteria that split water to produce O2, so produce molecular oxygen. That now makes up a large portion of our atmosphere. This developed later, of course, but the other important thing is just that, like, if somebody were to say which organism played an extremely important role in the early Earth, you would want to think cyanobacteria, and the reason being because oxygen plays an important role in our bodies. It's the final electron acceptor in the respiratory complexes, and without it, we'd be in a little bit of trouble. We probably would not be able to achieve the level of complexity we've achieved today. So it's kind of interesting that they played such a vital role, and still do play a role in oxygen production in the atmosphere.